Welcome back to Open Heart Conversations, where we come together as community to explore the world's enduring spiritual and religious traditions. I'm your host, Reverend Renee Rossi, and I'm so happy to be back with all of our viewers and our listeners. Today, we are exploring a really timely and important topic, tending to grief through ritual. And we have the most perfect guest to take us on this journey. He is an award-winning author, an artist, a ritualist, and a teacher, Day Schildkret. Day, welcome to Open Heart Conversations.
I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'm so happy to have you here. I'm just such a huge fan of your work and your message and everything that you do. So I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I wish we were doing it at a lunch table and we had food and a little wine and
yes.
Well, we'll just pretend.
Yes, let's pretend. So I wanted to start with a rather personal question. I was hoping that you would share your story with us, particularly your story of how you came to write your first book, which is titled Morning Altars, a 7-step practice to nourish your spirit through nature, art, and ritual. I know there was some grief and there were some things that really were the catalyst for your work and for finding and developing this process. So can you speak to that time in your life?
Sure. The book was almost a consequence of a certain time of my life. It was born from that. But I'd say it began much earlier than the writing of the book, which was, I'd say around 2010, 2011. But again, it's like really hard to say where this all began. But my father died in 2011. And that year, I also went through a major relational split, a divorce, but we weren't married, but it was a domestic partnership. And my days were almost like walking around like a daydream. You know, if you've experienced death or you've experienced divorce, you know that, the grief can undo you in a way. And it can be very hard to attend to the regularities of everyday life. Just to get on a phone call or to answer emails can feel like scaling a mountain when you're in the ebb and flow of grief. And when you're so close to the loss. So my life was pretty undone at the time. And the consequence of my father dying also gifted me with a dog. And it's funny that we're talking about this because this week was her 5-year anniversary of her death. And so we can go into that in a bit. But Rudy was a miniature schnauzer. She was my dad's dog for 9 years. And then I adopted her literally on his deathbed. I basically said, I got you. I said that to her. She, maybe this is me projecting, but she seemed to really understand it. And she saved my life at the beginning because my tendency with that grief, with that kind of heartbreak, was to hermit myself and to stay inside and to think and to be overwhelmed and to not know what to do with my grief and that loss. And so Rudy needed her needs tended to every day. And so we would find ourselves on these long walks through the park and the hills of Wildcat Canyon, which is where I was living in the Bay Area. And on these walks, I would be, my head would be down because I was thinking a lot, and she would just be curious and interested and would really lead the way. And on those walks I would just find these amazing gifts, I don't know what else to call them, of nature, a crow feather, a cluster of elderberries, eucalyptus bark, whatnot. And they would pop me out of my grief for just a second, and I would be able to see the world again. And then I kind of fell back into it. And anyway, so the story goes, her and I would walk to the top of this hill. And one morning, it was right past dawn. it was beautiful. The light was beautiful. Everything was beautiful. I was totally wrecked still. And underneath this eucalyptus tree were these amber colored mushrooms that were growing and glistening in the morning dew. And I don't know, it was maybe years and years of just playing in nature, but I sat under that tree and I started to rearrange the mushrooms. And I started to pull eucalyptus caps and eucalyptus barks. And I created, in an hour, which felt like a minute, I created what I've come to call morning altars, which are really impermanent nature art, and dedicational art, devotional art. And that morning, I looked down and I looked in, and I recognized that for the first time in probably 7 or 8 months, that I felt lighter. I wasn't totally smushed by my grief. In a way, I was transforming it. I was metabolizing it through making something with my hands. When I really looked at it, I was taking many pieces, like those eucalyptus caps or bark or mushrooms, and bringing them into some semblance of order, something that looked orderly and symmetrical and beautiful. And that reminded me that there was such a thing, because grief is so destabilizing and it can feel like everything's just in chaos. So just by bringing those pieces together, it lightened me in a way that I hadn't experienced since my dad died. And then I dedicated it to my healing and to my grief and to the loss in my life. And in that moment, I made a challenge to myself. Could I return to that spot for 30 days and make one every day? Because I felt how significant it was for me. And so I did. Rudy and I would go on these walks and I'd collect material. I'd sit under the same tree. I'd spend an hour making a new piece of art. I devote it or dedicate it to something in my life or something in the world that needed dedication and acknowledgement. And that was like 11 years ago, and I haven't stopped. I make one every day. And so, in a way, I was transforming my grief into beauty. And I was metabolizing that grief into something that really fed my life. And now it's feeding thousands of people who are going out into where they live and making art out of nature from their place and then dedicating it to what's going on in their lives. And then suddenly this one seed that I was sprouting for myself and really came from a desperate need, to really feel like I had some ground under me. And now it's amazing to witness, every week just getting so many images and DMs and Instagram tags and all of these things from people in, Peru, Poland, England, Australia, Iran, where people are making these pieces for their lives and from their land. And so my work's been really dedicated to bridging the pieces of grief and loss, beauty and creativity, and meaning making and ritual. And that's really the nature of my first book, and it's also the nature of my second book that just came out.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think, I love how you have all this evidence and all this proof, how this is rippling out in the world all over the planet, really, because I feel like what you are giving people is something that they can anchor themselves to in a moment when they, as you described it, as chaos, when you really experience grief, you don't feel like you're really tethered to anything. And so even just to have those moments of you're okay in this moment, even if it's just for this 1 second, it really can save people.
It's a strange thing to say, because I completely agree with what you just said. And at the same time, through another lens, grief is the ultimate tethering. because it's basically saying, I love this being or this place or this whoever relationship, and I lost them and I miss them because I love them. So when there's grief in the field, it's really it's a human skill to be able to express love. But in our modern culture, we see it as an affliction and something to get over because we're completely obsessed with productivity and growth and being on top of our games and all of these things. And
right.
We don't have any tolerance for anything that can kind of like humble us or, wreck us or heartbreak us. And so oftentimes we see grief as something to overcome, like an obstacle, but it is really deep down inside, it's a tethering. And I find that, nature and art and ritual are ways to remember that tethering, because it just so easily gets displaced and frayed and impossible to feel into in our modern lives. But making those altars for me was a way to actually remember the value of my grief and to see it as a human making capacity. It actually made me more human. My grief makes me more human. It makes my heart tender. It lets me have compassion. It allows me to see the temporariness of life and to not take it for granted. And so that, what's a better human making, and especially an adult making experience, and we need more of that, but we need to transform our understanding of grief.
I love that you said it makes you more human. I totally agree. And to your point, we are always avoiding the thing that's uncomfortable and painful. And, grief doesn't always allow you to avoid it. It takes over. So
yeah. It's an opportunity to pivot or lean towards, not turn away from. But sometimes, I was just listening to a podcast on my lunch break, and it was all about Ukraine. And, there's amazing devastation happening there. My family came from around that area, 3 generations ago. And there's, sometimes when there's so much loss, like a lot of loss, or the loss is too big to hold on your own, the grief actually, it's important to grieve, but it's important to grieve with other people. And it's important to be held in that space. My own tradition, my own culture, which is a Jewish culture, we do death and dying pretty well. And we have, like a grieving family, days, weeks after or 7 days for sure after the death, the house becomes what we call a Shiva house, which is basically a way for friends and family to show up and cook meals for and listen to and assist in the everyday realities of life, because we understand that the grieving family can't do that. But really what that's teaching me is that sometimes when the loss is so big, and that's subjective for sure, that we need other people to hold our hands and say, I have you. You're not alone. I've got you in this. Let's walk through this threshold together. And that's, so in a way, grief and loss are also community making endeavors. They're an opportunity for the people to come back together again and to remake themselves, So for instance, like last year, one of my best friends was diagnosed with breast cancer. And, her reality changed over, in a minute, her reality of how she understood herself from a healthy person to a sick person, how she understood her life changed. And I could see in talking to her that it was overwhelming her. And so I asked her if we could gather, 10 of her best friends on a Zoom ritual, or I would ask her 4 questions and we lit candles together to honor her. But really also what it did was that it gathered her people around her, and then all 10 of us became much closer. So her grief and her transition also brought her people together. So that's another aspect of grief, which is that it's a togethering experience. It doesn't always do this. There's no guarantee, but it can bring a community back together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. And it's important for the griever. It's important for, other people to be more human, to support someone in their grief. I think it goes both ways for sure. So, let's start talking about rituals a bit, as you so beautifully talked about morning altars, and your most recent book, which is called Hello, Goodbye, 75 Rituals for Times of Loss, Celebration, and Change. You've described it as a ritual cookbook. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think the easiest way the reason I call it a ritual cookbook is because I see ritual very akin to cooking. And I'm very much trying to destigmatize that whatever people have around this word, ritual. Because my major purpose is that I'm interested in a ritual renaissance. I think it's what we need in the world right now. So much change, epic change is happening, both familial, ancestral, community-wise, nationally, globally. There's enormous amounts of change happening, and we need to learn how to make meaning with it. This is a very human-centric skill, our capacity to make meaning. And especially by doing that, by making meaning, we can create a semblance of stability in the face of instability. And chaos. And so it gives us a temporary ground to stand on. So the reason I call it a cookbook, aside from the fact that I've literally created ritual recipes in it, I think there's about 36 life transitions in the book: birth, death, miscarriage, divorce, losing a pet, many, many more. And I'm really trying to give the capacity to make meaning and make ritual back to the people, and the people's imagination, because, ritual, when you think about it, it can either feel like it belongs to religion. It could also feel like it belongs to particular cultures and traditions. Mm-hmm. And they do, certain rituals do belong to certain people, and certain rituals do belong to certain religions, but the function and functionality of ritual itself doesn't belong to anyone. And it belongs to the people, and it has to be reimagined. So ritual has that dual function. It can be passed down. It can be traditional. It can live in a culture, right? It can be something that is stable and consistent and repetitive. And also, it needs contemporary relevance. It needs to feel important to you or a community. So ritual also needs to be reimagined and reinvented and repurposed. And it's the same thing about ingredients, by the way. For instance, my family has a recipe, mandel bread, which has been passed down through the women in our family. I grew up on this food. It's like a soft biscotti kind of thing. But at the same time, I'm using a recipe that was passed down through the traditions. But when I make it, I particularly use, like when I'm in California, I use California almonds, or I use dried fruit of the season that we're in. So I like to change the recipe to suit my palate and also my values. And ritual is very similar. So, I, for instance, as I said, grew up in Jewish culture, and which has been an enormous teacher for me about rituals. I mean, since I was basically like 1 year old, learning the rituals of my people. But it can't just be that, because they turn stale very quickly. It could just be like people reciting things and it doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. So I've always, as an artist, I'm always looking to reimagine, like, how can this be relevant? How can we bring things back together? And so ritual has those dual components, but really, it's very much in the fashion of cooking. For instance, like I have friends who are world famous chefs, and I have friends who basically can barely cook an omelet. And, and they're, of course they're different, but it's like, you got to eat. You're making a
Right.
fancy meal or you're making a basic meal, you still are needing to eat. Rituals very similar. There's elaborate rituals that feel very, I think, intimidating. And then there can be very simple, everyday rituals where you barely need anything, but it's just the act of making the ritual that is transformative. And so rituals are very similar to food in that sense, which is like, just make it, just try it, and maybe and not all rituals, quote unquote, work. I've been a part of many failed rituals, but it's the attempt that matters. It's the attempt to make something meaningful, to actually, as the ethnographer Arnold van Gennep says, to pivot towards the sacred in many moments, whether that's like going to bed at night or waking up in the morning, whether that's the loss of your pet or, your child becoming a big brother or sister. It's all of these moments have an opportunity for us to pivot towards the sacred and to just make something of those moments.
I love it feels like an invitation and also permission for people to use their creativity and to sort of do what feels good to them, what feels right to them, what is meaningful to them, instead of having to follow something that's prescribed and just doesn't connect.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why in this book, I talk a lot about the recipes, in the ritual recipes in terms of like, hey, just like if you make something, you're gluten-free or you're vegan or whatever, you substitute recipes to still make the meal. I created these recipes and I constantly am telling my readers, just if I'm telling you to bury something and you really, you're vibing with burning something or whatever, like do that. These are just like, we're being creative. Ritual lives in the symbolic. And as a modern culture that comes from a rational, minded history, since basically the 1700s, we value utilitarian and functional and rational behaviors. And that's why there's been a super decline in ritual, devaluing of rituals, because it's ritual's not interested in the functional or the rational. It's interested in the symbolic. It's interested in you externalizing what's happening internally or you internalizing what's happening externally. It's an opportunity for your psyche to see in front of it what it's experiencing internally. So, for example, there's a chapter in the book on surviving trauma and surviving near-death experiences. And one of the rituals, there's 3 parts to it, but it's simply, the first part is in the presence of witnesses, the person that survived a near-death experience to first write on each stone. There's like maybe 10 stones with some kind of chalk or charcoal, to write on each one, essentially what was lost from this near-death experience, and to stack them up so high, kind of Jenga style, that they actually collapse. That's the first. There's 3 parts of that ritual, but that's the first part, is to keep stacking the stones as they collapse, and to keep stacking them and let them collapse. Because there is an experience for someone who went through a trauma of an actual collapse of their being. And to be able to see the stones do it, and to keep on seeing the stones do it, allows the grief to come forward. And then there's the second part of the ritual, which is about washing the stones. So actually removing the writing on them, washing them, like really tending, forgiving, grieving, allowing, like all of these words that, sure, they're concepts. So it's very easy for us to like say, like, we really need to like forgive ourselves, but that's not enough, but it's in the act of working with the elements like fire, water, air, or earth, where we can actually see the very thing happen symbolically. And then when we see it symbolically, it touches upon part of us that is way older than our rational mind. And that part of our psyche very often needs symbolism to understand what's changed.
That sounds like a very powerful ritual. Thank you for sharing that. What you're drawing my attention to really is how important the person doing the ritual is. Like, they are maybe the most important part of the ritual. A lot of times, some people, you think of rituals, you think of the items you have and the words you say, but really it's the human who's doing the ritual.
Yeah, it's the actual person.
It seems so obvious, but also, sometimes the focus is on the items and the things, and really it's what's happening to the person who's doing it.
Yeah, it's very similar. Yeah, I worked in the theater for many years on Broadway specifically. And so I come with that history to a lot of what I do, and it informs a lot of who I am. And, it's very similar to theater, which is, you have the props and you have the lighting and you have the set and the scenery, and, and that's all great. That's all necessary. Sometimes it's elaborate, sometimes it's very simple, but it's about the story. You're telling a story, and the actors are embodying characters. And the other piece is they're being witnessed by an audience. So those are the flavors also of ritual, which is that, you have to be mindful of the set and setting. A lot of rituals, especially vulnerable ones, need privacy. You have to tend to the space beforehand. Everything matters, the kind of lighting and the way you set the seats and who you invite or disinvite or exclude from the ritual. There's a great book called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, who talks a lot about excluding skillfully. All of these things matter, but none of them guarantee that it goes anywhere. And the same thing with theater. Just because you have the right props and the right set and the right scenery and the right lighting, it doesn't mean that the show is successful. And just because the actors practice doesn't mean they're successful either. There has to be a willingness to see ritual as alive, just like live theater. And what's exciting about, for instance, live theater, is that there's a relationship that forms between the actor and the audience. And it's based on it being a vulnerable or tender relationship, meaning that anything could happen. People could forget their lines. Something can go wrong with the set. I mean, someone's bringing a totally new take on the character or a new way of, hitting a note in the song. And it's in that aliveness where you realize you're in something very precious. And it's the same thing that happens in ritual, where, there's no guarantee that because you do something, anything happens. So there has to be a willingness to bring your vulnerable self to the ritual, and to reflect on certain questions that could help kind of bring that vulnerability out. And then that action that really breaks your heart open. For instance, we talked about my dog, Rudy. She died 5 years ago this week. Right after, and there's a whole chapter, I talk about this in the book, called Loss of a Pet. And there was a time, her and I were tethered to each other quite literally with the leash, every day for 9 years with that leash, twice a day at least, and then the day after she died, the leash was just sitting by the front door. It had no purpose anymore. I couldn't throw it out. So I decided to ritualize that moment, because I needed to see the end of that particular part of our relationship. Otherwise it meant nothing. All those walks would mean nothing if the ending didn't mean anything. So I took that leash, and I was inspired by my Jewish culture's. We have a certain tradition of rendering clothes. Certain cultures do hair. We do clothes. We tear our clothes when there's mourning. Some of us that don't want to tear our clothes, we wear a torn ribbon over our heart so that we can remember and other people can see that and witness us as mourners. And so I tore or cut her leash. And I turned that leash from a routine object into a ritual object because I wore that little cut. It's right here, by the way. I keep it on my altar. I wore this little ribbon over on my jacket over my heart for a year. And that was a way for me to remember our relationship and my longing for her. And also it was a way for other people to ask me what it's about. And so it was an opportunity for many conversations to be points of remembering her. And so I really just made that up on the spot. But it was a way for me to really to use my skill of ritualizing or creating, doing symbolic actions, which was the cutting of this cord. This has no purpose. Like most people would say a cut leash is like, it's garbage. I destroyed the purpose of the leash by doing this, right? Mm-hmm. But I gave it another purpose, which is purely symbolic. And the symbolism is a way for my psyche to both remember my dog, long for her, and also, really connect into the grief I have still, which is really my love for her.
Mm-hmm. I have read that chapter of your book, and I am so grateful that you created those rituals because, so many of us have pets that we adore and that we pour so much love into, and they pour back into us. And, having a first step to take on how to face that and something that you can do to honor that love and that relationship, I think is so healing for so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we don't really have many collective ways of grieving our pets, and walking through that threshold. And our culture, I tell a story in the book about like days after she died, I had to change a flight, and the person, I was like, I have a death in the family, to the flight, to the person, I don't know what they're called, the customer service. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you have a death certificate? And I said, no, not really. I wasn't given one from the vet. And she said, oh, it's a dog or it's an animal. I said, yeah. She said, oh, we don't consider that family. And that just pierced me. She was more than family to me. So having a cultural understanding of how we treat loss and how we certain things matter, certain things don't matter, how we respect and honor our grief. We really are in a grief illiterate culture and a death phobic culture. And so that was a hard pill to swallow. So part of what I'm doing in that chapter is really giving people resources and acknowledging and affirming that this creature matters to you, and that the beginning of their lives and the middle of their life mattered, so their ending must matter too. That's the full breadth of their life. So, but most of us don't know what to do in those moments because we're so heartbroken about what's happening, and we feel like we're kind of like floundering and trying to keep this creature alive. So, actually having some guidance or a recipe to say, here are some things you can do to make this moment meaningful. If you don't make it meaningful, it becomes meaningless. And that's a great way to suppress emotion. That's a great way to be in denial. That's a great way to miss what's happening, to honor this creature, my family did that with our childhood dog, and I regret it to this day. She had a stroke and we dropped her off at the vet to euthanize her, and we weren't even there with her at the end of that. And that's really heartbreaking, because we were there with her for, from her 6 months until she died. But my family didn't have a lot of resources when it came to making meaning. So I think if they had more resources, we could have done something together and actually would have been vulnerable together and listened to each other's grief and grown stronger as a family if we did that. But it was just we didn't have much resource as modern people, and we didn't, and our own culture doesn't really have anything to say about pets. So that's, why I wrote that chapter. Yeah.
I really feel that. So, you've given us so many reasons why ritual is so important when we're tending to our grief and we're going through something traumatic. Can you speak a little bit about other times to do rituals? Like, when is it a good time to do a ritual? Do you have to be in a place of pain? Can you talk about that?
Yes, you only have to be in a place of pain.
I know the answer, but please tell everyone.
No, of course. I mean, that's why the subtitle in the book is, 75 rituals for times of loss, celebration, and change. And I think those are the three gateways. Something happens that we've talked about loss this whole time, but also, change can also be celebratory. Moments of birth or new beginnings, moving into a new home or getting a new job or being in a new relationship, or, your kid becomes a big brother or a big sister. There's so many moments, or becoming a grandparent. I mean, that's a huge one for a lot of people. So these moments, but they're also identity changing moments, or they're life-changing moments. So moving into a new home, that's a wonderful thing, but it's also for many people, it could be a struggle, or even becoming a big brother or big sister. I mean, that could be a beautiful moment. That could also be a struggle. There could be moments of jealousy or resistance, or, but there's a change in identity that happens with those moments. They're celebratory, but there's also a change. And so the ritual itself helps to affirm the change, but also transform the person. This is where ritual and ceremony meet. Ceremonies are affirmational. They affirm something or confirm something, and rituals are transformational. And this is this understanding was broken down by another ethnographer named Victor Turner. The difference between affirming someone in a new role and transforming something or someone. And so we need to walk in a ceremonial and ritualistic way in our lives so that we can continue to change as things change. Life always is changing. Someone new walks in, someone old leaves. A new relationship begins, an old relationship ends. We are in a new house, we leave an old house. We start a new job, we end an old job. That's the reason I call the book Hello, Goodbye, is we're constantly saying hello and goodbye. But we have become severely disconnected from making those moments matter, from actually being good hosts, to actually welcoming or saying goodbye. And so most of the time, many of us are just trying to keep pace with our lives and keep pace with the change happening. And so we're racing through these moments, racing through them. It happened with the pandemic. suddenly like life changed. And then so many of us are like trying desperately to return to normal. It's understandable, but it is not at all what's needed in a crisis. The word crisis itself speaks to what's needed. The word itself, the etymology of the word crisis, means to distinguish or discern, to basically say, this time is different than the time that was. This is not that time. This is this time. Different skills are needed. Different resources are needed. Different ways are needed. To be able to learn how to distinguish what was from what is a very, very important part of ritual. So that we make these marks and distinctions so that we don't confuse ourselves. For instance, I interviewed almost 300 people for this book. And one of them was a woman who worked at her job for like 35, 38 years. Long time, by the way, to be at one job. She retired, didn't do really anything to mark the moment, and then was waking up every day for 2 years with anxiety attacks because her psyche still thought she was in the job. So she was worried that her boss was mad at her, or she was late for work, or she was missing a project. And it wasn't until she did a ritual that she was able to discern that time is not this time anymore. And she needed to see it before her. And she needed to be witnessed in it. Like it was too big to do on her own. She needed other people to look at her and say, this is happening. You're retired. You're not in that life anymore. You have new purpose. You have a new identity. And the ritual was the gathering place for the people. And it was an opportunity for her to see that her life had changed.
Yeah, so it brings clarity to the moment. It brings clarity to the situation, the time, the place, not just physically, but emotionally and symbolically. What you're saying to me, it feels like you can see what's real.
Yeah, I'd say the other word is understanding. It brings a sense of understanding because change is disorienting. So it brings orientation. So we can actually look around, and because like life, if you don't slow down or stop, you still think you're on the same path, but like you might be on a totally different path and not know it. There's a comparison. I talk about ritual, which is in the book, which is about cairns, CAIRNS. They're the stack of stones on a path. And this is a great metaphor for a ritual because we could be walking on the path, right? But there's someone that came before you, or many people, to stack these rocks to say, don't keep going. Turn here. That's not the right path anymore. The right path is now to turn. Change the path. And ritual works in a very similar way, which is it's an opportunity to, as we're crossing a threshold, to not think that we are on the same path, but to turn, or even better word is to return to what's important, to where you are now, to who you are now, to really come back and to look at your life and to see what's changed. And so they serve as a very, a similar marking moment. You mark thresholds so that you can discern to not keep on going in the same direction. Something changed.
I'm so glad you brought that word in, threshold. I was waiting for you to say it.
There you go.
Thank you. So, what could happen to a person? Like, let's just speculate or fantasize someone who brings ritual into their life and makes it a daily practice. Like, how might that affect their lives?
To make ritual into a daily practice?
Or integrate it into their lives, a regular practice, maybe not daily, but something that, they do regularly.
Yeah. So for instance, a daily practice would be, a ritual upon waking up in the morning, right? So that's a very good example of change. You're no longer sleeping, you woke up. Here's the thing. Some people didn't. Some people did not wake up this morning, but you did. So there's two things you can do. Number one, you can go on Instagram or Facebook or play, Wordle on your phone or whatever. You can get up and take a shower and eat breakfast and try and get to your desk for work. Basically, just ignore the fact that you woke up. Or you can wake up and not take it for granted because that moment mattered, or you're remembering that moment mattered. So you can take some time to acknowledge that this happened. You woke up and it wasn't a guaranteed thing. And one day it won't, but it happened today and it might happen again. And the ritualizing of that moment is, in a way, the benefit of it is to turn towards the sacredness of life, to remember the sacredness of life, and to make it sanctified, or to make it whole, to bring it back together, bring it back into your memory, and start your day remembering. Another really easy example is during writing the entire book of Hello Goodbye. Every night before I went to bed, I took a coffee filter for the next morning, and with a pencil, I wrote a reminder to my morning self for everything I learned that day, an important lesson, or anything I wanted my morning self to remember. I wrote it, a one sentence on the coffee filter, and then I would go to bed. And I'd wake up in the morning, and before making coffee, I'd look at that reminder, and it made my coffee experience from routine to ritual, because it was an opportunity for me to remember, which is a very core function of ritual, is to help us remember, to remember. Robin Wall Kimmerer says in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she says, our elders tell us ceremony is our people's way to remember to remember. Why? Because life and being human is so easy to forget. So easy to forget what it means to be human, because it's just going so fast, and there's so many things that are overwhelming and distracting, and tries to, wrestle for priority of your life. So we need these little reminders, these, oh yeah, that, like I woke up, or I went to bed, or, I'm eating, or someone's visiting, or whatever. Mm-hmm. We need these moments that to help us remember what's important. Because if we don't do that consistently, we forget.
Yeah, and I see how that then snowballs into remembering gratitude, remembering to have awe for what is happening in your life, remembering love or passion that you have for someone or something. It would have to touch all parts of your life.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's many consequences. I mean, some days it could be gratitude, other days it could be, praise, other days it could be, feeling of grief and longing. I mean, there's no like set determination of consequence of doing something like that. Every day for me is different. I have a ritual in the morning of one of them of lighting the candles on my altar, and I sing a song while I'm lighting it. And basically the song is it's a spiritual that the lyrics are, this may be the last time. And, that helps, doing that little ritual of lighting the candles helps me reorient to the very true reality that we always forget, that it could be the last. And by remembering that, it reorients me towards some of the things you mentioned: gratitude, praise, appreciation, humility, whatever it is. And just doing that simple ritual enriches my life so profoundly, because then when I come on a podcast like this, and if this was the last one I ever did, you're damn well right. I'm going to show up with all of my heart and all of my learned wisdom and give it my all. And that's a very real possibility. One podcast in the future today might be my last. So bringing that uncertainty in and consideration in actually enriches. It's not something I fear. It's something that I can behold, which is a great word, by the way. We should use that word more often, to actually hold something and elevate it, which is the word be. When you put the word be in front of a word, it's the enhancement of. So I'm not just holding my life, but I'm beholding it. I'm raising it up to admire and proclaim and praise this life, which is a really good antidepressant, by the way.
Yes. Well, speaking from my personal experience, I feel that comes through when you are speaking about your work. When I've listened to many of your podcasts, I'm actually a student of yours, and the way that you show up for all of us and share all of your wisdom and everything that you've learned and experienced. Like, I always feel you show up with your whole heart, and
thank you.
Say thank you for that, because it doesn't go unnoticed.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, it's not always comfortable, but I'm doing my best to model, both for myself and other people, what, a genuine offering, a genuine heartfelt offering could be in a time where we really are experiencing a great displacement of authenticity in place of performance. And that's just not how I am. And that's not how I want to, that's not who I want the world to be. And so I'm putting my stake in the ground for, genuine engagement and caring and slowing down with people, and letting myself be vulnerable, not as a bad thing, but as a point of connection. I'm very good with boundaries too, but I'm like, it's like skin. There's a certain permeability that needs to happen between us. And, and I think not too long ago, and certain cultures today do this very well still, a certain sense of genuine connection and slowing down with each other. But our modern culture is really just on a tilt towards, productivity overhaul and, speed and tech and money, and, and so we have to reclaim that so we don't lose our humanity.
Well, Day, I could ask you questions for about 12 more hours, but I am hoping if you're willing, you'll maybe send us off with reading something from one of your books.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let me read the conclusion of Hello, Goodbye, or at least a portion of it. Every hello is a goodbye, and every goodbye a hello. Births and deaths, departures and arrivals, endings and beginnings. There cannot be one without the other. We wave our hands to welcome, and we wave them the exact same way to bid farewell. Even though at times we may believe that life only moves in one direction, if we can step back and broaden our gaze, we can see that these hello, goodbye moments hinge on a door that swings back and forth. This bit has been a book about rituals. Rituals place us right at that door's threshold, and their purpose is to help us acknowledge that something happened. Something has changed. We are no longer the person we were. We no longer have the relationship we did. We no longer call this place home. Our child is not the same. Our body is not the same. This time is not the same. Rituals mark distinctions, helping us recognize what was and what is, so that we can wonder how it came to be. How did my child become a teenager? How did I just survive cancer? How did I get to be 50 years old? To wonder like this takes real courage and a deeper vulnerability, because to see change is to be changed. I'll stop there.
Everyone listening and watching, please go out and buy Day's books. If you don't have them already, please sign up for his teacher training. But Day, tell the audience how they can get more information about your work and all of your offerings.
Sure. Morningaltars.com, morningaltars.com, is the hub of my art, some of my teachings, and especially which you're a part of, one of the things I'm most proud of these days is this teacher training, which is an opportunity to learn the practice and a deeper dive into nature, art, and ritual. And I'm sure you could talk about that and how your experience has been, and then I'd say other ways to get in touch with me are Instagram. If you like, a burst of beauty in your day, Morning Altars is the name of the Instagram account. And I have a lot of events coming up. So in addition to the teacher training, I'm going to be in Minnesota. I'm going to be in New York City, and a bunch of other events that you can check in or join my newsletter mailing list. Oh, that's another thing I never talk about, but I should, because I'm quite proud of the content I'm putting out in my newsletters. They are deeply reflective about my own life or what's happening in the world, but told through a deep spiritual lens and a genuine lens. And so I'm not just, putting out schlock. I actually am really trying to speak from the heart, and speak about my life in the world and how we can find our way back to our humanity.
It's a beautiful newsletter. It's from the heart. That's how I receive it, heart to heart. So
thank you.
You do a great job with that. Yes, we're really, I hope everyone checks out all of those resources you just shared. And we also have a series we created with Day, a beautiful free video series on our website that Day takes you through the 7 steps of the Morning Altars practice. So I hope everyone checks that out as well. Day, thank you so much for this conversation. You shared so many tools and so much wisdom and so much of your personal experience. And we're really, all of us here at the United Palace are so appreciative.
I'm so grateful to have such a interested and collaborative partnership with you, and keep doing your good work in the world.
Yes. And to all of our viewers and listeners, thank you for participating in Open Heart Conversations. Until next time, take care.